The snow was falling gently over the small ranch town of Elko, Nevada, when Mary slipped on her gloves and stepped out into the biting cold. She'd taken the same walk every morning for the past 6 months, always passing the old pasture on the edge of town. But this morning was different. As she neared the fence, a wild neigh cut through the air, raw, desperate, almost human. Mary was 68, recently widowed, and every corner of her house felt like a museum of memories she couldn't bear to dust. Her late husband, George, had been a quiet man who loved horses more than words. Since his death, the silence had turned into a weight she carried in her chest. Her days had become an endless loop of coffee, walks, and aching quiet. She usually avoided the old Miller pasture. Ever since the horses had been removed years ago, it had stood empty, abandoned, overgrown. But now, behind the fence, stood a wild, mud-caked stallion, muscles trembling, eyes wide with something between fear and rage. He was pawing the frozen ground like he'd been running for hours. Mary froze. Horses didn't just appear here, certainly not alone and definitely not in this condition. His mane was tangled with burrs, his hooves cracked and bloodied. But what stopped her wasn't his state. It was the way he looked at her, like he knew her, like he was seeing a ghost. She stepped closer, slowly, not daring to blink. The stallion tossed his head and let out another cry. This one shorter, sharper, a sound that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. Mary's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his eyes she couldn't explain. Not just fear, recognition. Years ago, George had cared for a colt named Whiskey, a horse they'd both adored but had to give up when money ran tight. They never spoke of it again, but Mary remembered the day George cried behind the barn. Whiskey had a distinct scar above his left eye, a white crescent, like a moon. Her eyes now searched the stallion's face, desperately, and there it was. A pale scar, faint but unmistakable. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. This horse should be long gone, sold to another ranch, maybe even dead. Yet here he was, in front of her, alone, terrified and calling out like he'd waited years for this moment. Mary's hands trembled as she reached for the old gate latch, half frozen shut. The horse took a step back, eyes locked on her, breath steaming in the winter air. She hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't Whiskey? But deep down in that aching part of her soul, she knew. The latch gave way with a metallic snap. The horse didn't bolt. He stood his ground, shaking slightly, his chest heaving. Mary took a step inside the fence, heart pounding. "Whiskey," she whispered. The name cracked like glass in the frozen morning. A sudden gust of wind tore across the field, and in that moment the stallion lunged forward. Not to flee, but toward her. Mary gasped, instinctively bracing for impact. But instead of knocking her down, he stopped inches from her chest and lowered his head. Mary placed a trembling hand on his muzzle, her fingers brushing against the scar as if to confirm it was real. The stallion didn't flinch. Instead, his entire body sagged slightly, like a soldier finally surrendering. For a second, it was as if time folded in on itself. She was 40 again, standing beside George, feeding whiskey apples in the summer light. But the moment shattered as reality crashed in. This horse had clearly been through something horrific. Ribs pressed against his skin, his coat was dull, and patches of hair were missing. His eyes darted nervously every few seconds. He'd seen things no animal should see, and survived. Mary knew the laws in her county. A stray like this, even if recognized, was technically livestock and not hers. She'd have to report it and risk losing him again. Worse, if he'd escaped from a breeder or fight ring, claiming him could pull her into something dangerous. People like that didn't just give up what they owned. Still, she couldn't leave him there. Not again. She remembered the guilt George carried until his last breath. They'd told themselves giving Whiskey up was necessary, but it broke something in both of them. Mary felt that old fracture open again, raw and aching. This time, she wouldn't look away. She led him to her small barn at the edge of her property, just a few blocks away. He followed, limping slightly, but never once pulling back. The townspeople stared, some even took photos. A few called out, asking where she got him. Mary kept walking, whispering softly to him, her voice the only thing holding them both together. Inside the barn, she covered him in old blankets, gave him warm water, and dug out the last of the oats from a storage bin she hadn't touched in years. He ate slowly, cautiously, each movement pained. When she brushed his mane, he didn't resist. He just closed his eyes. Later that night, a knock at the door made her flinch. A local deputy stood outside, hat in hand. "Ma'am, folks said you brought in a stray stallion. You didn't register it." His tone wasn't cruel, just procedural. But Mary's heart pounded like it had back when she was a girl caught sneaking out. "I know him," she said softly. "He's not a stray. His name is Whiskey. He belonged to my husband. To me." The deputy squinted, clearly skeptical. "You'll have to prove that, ma'am." He handed her a notice. She had 72 hours to provide documentation or surrender the horse. She shut the door slowly, the paper crinkling in her hand. She had no papers, no proof. George never kept anything. Everything had been done on trust and handshakes. All she had was memory, and a scar, and a horse that chose her over freedom. That night she sat by his side in the barn, the cold creeping in, and whispered, "I won't lose you again." By morning he was worse. Fevered, shivering, unable to stand. Mary wrapped him tighter, fed him by hand, wiped the sweat from his neck with warm cloths. Each hour she checked on him, praying the fever would break. She couldn't afford a vet, and even if she could, involving one could risk a report. On the second night, as the wind howled through the cracks in the barn, she pulled an old radio from the attic and played George's favorite country station. She curled up beside Whiskey, her body aching with fatigue. "You're home now?" she whispered. "We both are." At dawn, something shifted. Mary woke to a soft nudge against her shoulder. Not the wind, not a dream. Whiskey was standing, unsteady but upright, his head low and eyes clear. She sat up slowly, tears rushing to her eyes. He was still with her. He had chosen to stay. Word had spread quickly in the small town, and by noon, a woman named Jenna, a retired vet tech, showed up at the gate with a medical bag. "I heard what happened," she said gently. "I won't report him. I just want to help." Mary hesitated, but something in Jenna's voice felt trustworthy. She nodded. Jenna worked for hours, cleaning wounds, applying ointment, giving him antibiotics. "He's been through trauma," she muttered, "but his heart's strong. He wants to live." Mary watched in silence, one hand resting on Whiskey's neck. For the first time in years, she didn't feel useless. She felt needed. Later that week, a neighbor brought over hay, and another dropped off a fresh supply of oats. People began to stop by, not out of suspicion, but curiosity and kindness. Kids drew pictures of the ghost horse who came back. Someone started calling Mary the horse whisperer, and the name stuck. But the deadline loomed. With no documents to prove her claim, she feared they'd come for him. One afternoon, digging through George's old trunk in the attic, Mary found a worn photograph. It showed George, young and proud, holding a colt, and on the back, written in his scrawl, "Whiskey, summer '93. It wasn't legal proof, but it was something. She brought it to the sheriff's office, heart pounding. The deputy examined it, rubbed his chin, and made a quiet call. After a long silence, he looked up. "I'll note that he's with you for now, but keep him safe, ma'am. Not everyone's as forgiving." That night, Mary sat in the barn and held the photo up for Whiskey to see. "You remember this?" she asked with a smile. He nuzzled her arm gently, as if to say yes. The photo went up on the barn wall, just above his stall. It was the first decoration she'd put up since George passed. Day by day, Whiskey grew stronger. His coat began to shine again, and his steps grew steady. Mary even started singing to him old songs she hadn't dared hum in years. He responded with soft grunts, little tail flicks, and sometimes even rested his head on her shoulder. They were healing, together. One crisp morning, Mary saddled him up. Not to ride, but to walk beside him through the pasture trail. He followed without hesitation. They moved slow, in rhythm. Two survivors breathing the same quiet air. A passing hiker stopped, stunned. "That's a miracle horse," he whispered. Mary smiled. "He's my miracle." Spring arrived with a softness Mary hadn't felt in years. The pasture, once barren, was now green and dotted with wild flowers. Whiskey trotted freely along the fence line, his mane catching the sunlight, his movements fluid and proud. People from town started visiting just to watch him run. Mary turned part of her property into a small sanctuary, not just for Whiskey, but for two more rescue horses that Jenna helped her take in. It wasn't a formal ranch, but it didn't need to be. It was a place of second chances, built quietly from grief and grace, a place George would have loved. She started teaching local kids how to care for the animals. brushing, feeding, cleaning hooves. At first, she worried she was too old, too tired. But each child's laughter, each new bond formed, brought a lightness back into her steps. Her days were no longer silent. They were full. Whiskey remained her shadow. He followed her to the gate every morning and stood by her as she read letters or talked to George aloud under the oak tree. Sometimes he'd nudge her when she grew too quiet, as if reminding her, "You're not alone." And she wasn't. Not anymore. She framed the old photo of George and Whiskey, hanging it in her living room beside a new one. Her and Whiskey in the pasture. Both a little grayer, both still standing. Visitors always asked about the scar. "That's how I knew it was him," she'd say. "That's how he found his way home." Word of Mary's sanctuary spread beyond Elko. A local news crew came out, then a small feature ran in a Nevada magazine. Donations arrived in envelopes with notes that read, "For Whiskey, for George, for love that waits." Mary read every one, tears filling her eyes each time. She didn't want a spotlight. She only wanted to keep him safe. But somehow, by saving one horse, she'd reminded people what loyalty looked like, what memory meant, what it was to love something or someone enough to never let go, even after decades. Now, every evening, as the sun dips behind the hills, Mary sits on the porch with a mug of tea and watches the horses graze. Sometimes she talks to George, other times just listens to the wind. But always, she feels that same quiet presence beside her, hooves in the dirt, breath on the breeze. The scar that once marked Whiskey as lost now marked him as found. He was more than a horse. He was a promise kept. Proof that love, even broken by time, could find its way back if someone waited long enough. He didn't just return to her. He carried George's love with him. And in saving him, Mary didn't just rescue a horse. She rescued herself.